As significant advances are being made towards LGBTQ equality in certain parts of the world, the rhetoric being used against them in many places has ramped up as a result. The rhetoric has led to the passage of strict laws limiting the rights of LGBTQ individuals, including attempts at imposing the death penalty on those convicted of homosexuality. Many of the countries whose leaders have become increasingly critical of the LGBTQ rights movement are former colonies or historic antagonists of Western European powers, where the most strides towards equality have been made. This map shows which countries have signed a UN General Assembly Declaration of LGBT Rights, shown in green, and the countries that signed a 2008 statement opposing LGBT rights. As you can see, the green is concentrated in the West, and the red is concentrated in Africa and the Middle East, regions that have experienced European colonization. The anti-LGBTQ equality rhetoric is largely a response to the perceived imposition of Western values through imperial liberalism as described by Richard Schwader in What About FGM? If activists hope to continue their successes in other regions, they need to consider the culture of the places in which they are working. As demonstrated by the quote at the start of this video, some leaders, like Yahya Jammeh of the Gambia and Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, have become increasingly vocal against gay rights. In trying to understand the reason and the timing of these arguments, it is clear that these leaders are attempting to speak out against foreign powers imposing their morality inside the countries they lead. They link things like UN resolutions in support of equality to Western powers trying to continue their domination over the former colonies. Jammeh's quote shows that the LGBTQ equality movement in the Gambia is perceived to be linked to white people, and opposition to the movement is thus opposition to their former colonial masters. After the signing of an anti-gay law in 2014, Museveni acknowledged that Western opposition could negatively affect trade in his country, writing of a potential trade boycott by Western companies under the pressure of homosexual lobbies in the West. By following through with the law, he is able to shore up his anti-West, anti-imperial credentials. Countries like Russia, while never a colony but historically opposed to Western European power, also use anti-Western rhetoric in support of their current positions. Russia uses this issue to position itself as opposed to Western cultural imperialism being forced upon other countries. Terms like Western decadence and reference to homosexuality are common in Russian speeches and articles. The most prominent example of this being the anti-gay propaganda bill Vladimir Putin signed in 2013. He is quoted as saying, "Some countries think that there is no need to protect children from this. We do," clearly in reference to Western powers' growing support of LGBT equality. This position allows world leaders to change the root of the argument from denying the rights of individuals to protecting the integrity of local culture. Pro-equality activists in the West need to understand the culture of other countries before attempting to force through their agendas. Even if they manage to pass resolutions in the United Nations and win the support of important figures like Ban Ki-moon, activists will need to think about how their arguments are understood in the countries in which they are trying to work. It is also necessary to consider how they, as activists, are being considered. Many of the arguments currently being used to support the equality movement are based on Western culture. For example, the argument that LGBTQ people living their lives as they want does no harm to others and should thus be allowed, read well in the individualistic West, but it may not be as appealing in other cultures. Activists should instead shape new arguments after gaining insight into the culture of the places in which they are trying to work. The name of this section also highlights another problem facing activists. Even if the activists do not see themselves as holding ideas of the superiority of Westerners, the perception still exists. This perception has contributed to the success of anti-imperialism rhetoric being used in this context. If people wish to end the inequality faced by LGBTQ people, they need to overcome this perception. The equality movement is currently viewed by many as a bunch of white people trying to enlighten the dark continent. This is reminiscent of the civilizing mission that was used to justify the colonization of Africa and other parts of the world. To achieve more for equality, the movement needs to localize the fight and make it less of a civilizing mission. As Schwader highlights in his article, culture plays a crucial role in most things, and the current state of LGBTQ rights around the world is no exception. Culture helps to explain the strides that have been made in the West in recent years, as well as the increasingly inflammatory rhetoric against equality in other regions. The best explanation for this rhetoric is the perception of Western imposition of values and the connection of this legacy to the legacy of anti imperialism. If the inequalities faced by this marginalized community are to be resolved, the perception of the equal rights movement as imperialist will need to be overcome to remove the power of these leaders' rhetoric. To do this, culture will need to be factored into all future arguments and pushes for equality.